Have you ever pushed so hard for something to happen that you could feel your own soul getting tighter? Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop forcing, life starts moving again in ways you could not predict? Welcome back to the channel, my friend. Today we are going to talk about one of the most subtle traps on the spiritual path and one of the most common sources of daily suffering. Forcing. Forcing conversation. Forcing timing. Forcing relationships. Forcing outcomes. Forcing yourself to feel a certain way. Forcing your mind to calm down by yelling at it. Forcing the future to become safe by worrying harder. Forcing life to follow a script that only exists inside your head. And here is the strange part. Forcing looks like effort, and effort looks like strength. So we confuse the two. But forcing is not the same as wise effort. Forcing is fear wearing the mask of productivity. It is the mind saying, if I push hard enough, I can control impermanence. If I squeeze tightly enough, I can make reality behave. If I move fast enough, I can outrun uncertainty. Zen and Buddhist wisdom do not tell you to become passive. They do not tell you to sit down and let life crush you. They teach something far more practical and far more powerful. They teach you how to act without the poison of forcing, how to move with clarity rather than panic, how to apply effort without clinging to results, how to practice with a steady heart so that destiny is shaped by wisdom, not by desperation. Let me start by describing the feeling of forcing, because it hides in plain sight. Forcing has a certain flavor in the body. The jaw clenches, the shoulders rise, the breath becomes shallow. The mind repeats the same argument again and again. The heart feels like it is bracing for impact. Even when you succeed, the success feels thin, because you had to sacrifice your inner peace to get it. Forcing has a certain flavor in the mind too. The mind says, it must happen this way. It must happen now. They must understand me. They must choose me. I must be perfect. I must not fail. I must not look weak. I must not be left behind. Under every forced movement, there is a hidden fear. And under every hidden fear, there is attachment. Attachment is the belief that your safety depends on a condition, staying stable. When you attach, you try to control. When you try to control, you force. When you force, you suffer, because you are wrestling with a world that is built out of change. This is why the teaching of impermanence is not just a philosophical idea. It is the foundation for not forcing. Everything changes. People change. Feelings change. Circumstances change. Bodies change. Plans change. If you demand that change stops, you will spend your life in a fight you cannot win. So what is the alternative? The alternative is a different kind of strength. The strength of alignment. The strength of timing. The strength of patience. The strength of right effort. The strength of compassion. The strength of letting causes mature without choking them. This is where karma becomes deeply practical. Karma is cause and effect. When you force, you plant certain causes. Causes of tension. Causes of conflict. Causes of exhaustion. Causes of resentment. And those causes create predictable effects. You become more reactive. Your relationships become tighter. Your mind becomes noisier. You become easier to disturb. Even good things become stressful because you trained yourself to live in urgency. When you stop forcing, you plant different causes. Causes of clarity. Causes of patience. Causes of honest action. Causes of respectful boundaries. Causes of gentle persistence. And those causes create different effects. Your nervous system becomes steadier. Your mind becomes less addicted to control. Your speech becomes kinder. Your actions become more accurate. Life still changes, but you are no longer at war with it. Now let me share a Zen-style story. And as you listen, notice where your own life shows up. Because the point of this story is not entertainment. The point is awakening. The point is recognizing yourself without shame, and then choosing a wiser way. A long time ago, there was a young person who lived near a small temple on the edge of a forest. The young person had a restless mind and a strong desire to succeed. Not only succeed in the world, but succeed in becoming peaceful. They read teachings, listened to talks, and tried meditation. But nothing felt fast enough. Their mind was like a hand that could not stop squeezing. They would sit to meditate and try to force silence. When thoughts appeared, they would fight them. They would try to push the mind into emptiness the way you push it or that is stuck. The more they pushed, the more the mind pushed back. Thoughts became louder. The body became more tense. After sitting, they felt defeated, and then they forced themselves to sit longer, believing more effort would finally break the mind open. They did the same thing in life. In relationships, they tried to force closeness. If a friend seemed distant, they chased. If someone did not reply quickly, they imagined rejection and pushed for reassurance. In work, they tried to force recognition. They stayed late, said yes to everything, and then felt bitter that others did not appreciate them enough. In family, they tried to force understanding. They argued, explained, and defended, believing that if they could just say the perfect words, the old wounds would dissolve. But the more they forced, the more stuck they felt. It was like pulling on a knot and wondering why it tightened. One evening, after another day of forcing, they walked to the temple and found an old monk in the courtyard. The monk was sweeping leaves. The young person watched, irritated by how calm the monk looked. How can someone sweep leaves so slowly when the world is so urgent? How can someone be calm when life is full of problems? The young person approached and asked the monk for advice. They said, "I have been trying to practice, but my mind will not become peaceful. I try harder and harder, but it gets worse. How do I force my mind to stop?" The monk paused the broom and looked at the young person gently. He did not laugh. He did not scold. He asked a simple question. "When you squeeze water in your fist, what happens?" The young person frowned. "It leaks out." The monk nodded. "And when you open your hand, what happens?" "It rests there," the young person said, confused. The monk smiled. "Your mind is like water. If you squeeze, it escapes. If you open, it can settle." The young person felt annoyed. They wanted a method, a technique, a secret. They did not want a riddle. They said, "But if I do not force, nothing will change. If I do not push, I will stay the same." The monk returned to sweeping and said, "Come tomorrow morning before sunrise." The next morning, the young person arrived early. The air was cool. The sky was dim. The courtyard smelled of earth and dew. The monk was already there, carrying a clay pot filled with water. He placed it on the ground and handed the young person a small cup. "Take this cup to the stream and bring it back full." The monk said, "Do not spill a drop." The young person nodded, ready to prove themselves. They walked quickly, gripping the cup tightly. The more they focused on not spilling, the more their hands shook. The tighter they gripped, the more their muscles trembled. They tried to walk perfectly straight, but their body became stiff, and stiffness made balance worse. A few drops spilled. Their heart raced. They tried to control even harder. More drops spilled. They reached the stream, filled the cup, and rushed back. More drops spilled. By the time they returned to the courtyard, the cup was not empty, but it was not as full as it could have been. The young person looked down with frustration, waiting for judgment. The monk asked, "What happened?" "I tried not to spill," the young person said, "and I still spilled. I forced myself, and it still did not work." The monk nodded, then gave the young person the cup again. "This time," he said, "walk like you are carrying something precious, not like you are fighting an enemy." The young person tried again. They went to the stream. They filled the cup. They began walking back, but with a softer grip. They felt the bottom of their feet. They let their arms hang naturally. They breathed. They looked ahead, not at the cup with panic, but at the path with attention. A few drops still moved near the rim, but the cup stayed steadier. Less spilled. When they returned, the cup was fuller. The young person felt surprised. The monk asked again, "What happened?" "I did not force as much," the young person said. "I focused, but I did not squeeze." The monk nodded. "That is right effort." The young person looked at the cup. It was so simple, yet it revealed everything. Forcing had been turning even simple movement into a struggle. It had been creating tension, and tension had been creating mistakes. The young person began to see that forcing does not equal control. Forcing equals agitation, and agitation creates suffering. The monk then led the young person to a small garden behind the temple. There were young plants growing in neat rows. The monk pointed to a seedling and said, "Make it grow." The young person frowned. "I cannot make it grow." The monk said, "Try." The young person felt irritated, but they tried. They touched the leaves, pulled gently, then stopped. It was absurd. They could not stretch the plant into maturity. The monk asked, "What can you do for the plant?" "I can water it." The young person said, "I can remove weeds. I can protect it from being trampled. I can give it sunlight." The monk nodded. "That is practice. That is karma. You create conditions. You do not force results." This was the moment the young person finally understood what their life had been doing. They had been trying to pull seedlings into trees. They had been trying to force other people to heal on their schedule. They had been trying to force love to be stable by gripping it. They had been trying to force respect by chasing it. They had been trying to force their mind into silence by fighting it. And the truth is, you cannot force a living process without damaging it. Life is not a machine. Life is a field of condition. When you understand that, you stop trying to control the harvest by yelling at the soil. You start tending the field. The young person asked the monk, "So what do I do when I really want something? What do I do when I feel fear that if I do not push, I will lose everything?" The monk said, "First, notice your fear. Do not pretend it is not there. Fear is a condition. If you deny it, it controls you from the dark. If you see it, you can practice with it." Then, the monk said, "Ask yourself what you can actually influence. You can influence your actions, your speech, your attention, your intentions. You cannot fully control other people, timing, or the unfolding of outcome. When you try to control what you cannot control, you suffer. When you focus on what you can influence, you build wisdom." Then the monk said, "Do the work that is yours, and release what is not yours." This is the heart of not forcing. It is not laziness. It is clarity. The young person returned to their life and began practicing this teaching in small ways. When they sat to meditate, they stopped trying to force silence. They sat and watched the breath. When thoughts came, they noticed them like clouds. They said quietly in their mind, "Thinking," and returned to breath. Sometimes the mind was noisy. Sometimes it was calm. They stopped treating noise as failure. They stopped turning meditation into a fight. And here is the strange thing. Because they stopped fighting, the mind began settling on its own. Not every day, not instantly, but gradually. Like muddy water that clears when you stop stirring. The peace they wanted was not created by force. It was revealed by letting the agitation settle. They practiced in relationships too. When they felt anxious about someone pulling away, they noticed the urge to chase. They felt it in the body, the tightening, the heat, the urgency. They named it wanting, fear, attachment. Then they breathed. They asked, "What is wise?" Sometimes the wise action was to communicate calmly. Sometimes it was to give space. Sometimes it was to set boundaries. Sometimes it was to release the relationship because it was built on clinging rather than mutual respect. They began to see that forcing closeness often creates distance, while respect creates trust. Not always, because life is complex, but often enough to change their behavior. They practiced at work too. They stopped trying to force validation. They still worked hard, but they worked with a different intention. They focused on right effort, doing what is needed with care, without making their worth depend on applause. They spoke with more honesty. They rested when needed. They stopped living as if exhaustion was proof of virtue. The result was surprising. They were more effective. Not because they were pushing harder, but because their mind was clearer. And clarity is a stronger engine than panic. Now let me bring this teaching directly into your daily life. Because you might be thinking, this story is nice. But what do I do when my reality is urgent? What do I do when bills are due? When a relationship is shaking? When my mind is anxious? When my family is difficult? When my body is changing? When my future feels uncertain? Here is the core. Not forcing does not mean doing nothing. It means acting without clinging. It means doing what is wise in the moment, while accepting that outcomes are not fully owned by you. There is a deep Buddhist reason this works. Suffering is intensified by craving and clinging. Craving says, I must have this. Clinging says, it must stay. When reality fails to match craving and clinging, the mind generates conflict. That conflict becomes anxiety, anger, shame, and exhaustion. The mind then tries to solve the conflict by forcing. But forcing is just conflict turned into behavior. So the practice is to reduce conflict at the root. How? By seeing impermanence clearly. Everything changes. That does not mean you do not care. It means you stopped reading change like betrayal. When you accept impermanence, you stop forcing life to be stable. You begin building stability inside. Through mindfulness, compassion, ethical action, and right view. That inner stability is what makes you less desperate, less reactive, less likely to force. Now let us talk about destiny. Because many people force because they fear their destiny will collapse. They believe that if they loosen their grip, everything will fall apart. This belief is powerful, and it often comes from past experiences where things did fall apart. So the mind learned, grip harder. But destiny is not created by grip. Destiny is created by causes and conditions. Karma is the way your repeated intentions and actions shape the road you walk. If you force, you plant the cause of tension. If you plant tension, you harvest more tension. The road becomes stressful. If you practice wise effort, you plant the cause of clarity and steadiness. The road becomes more stable, not because the world stops changing, but because your mind stops shaking as much. That is what it means to be guided by wisdom rather than ragged by fear. Now, I want to address a subtle misunderstanding. Some people hear a teaching like do not force and they use it as an excuse to avoid effort. They call it spiritual surrender. But it is actually avoidance. Not forcing is not avoidance. Not forcing is engaged presence. It is doing what you can do without demanding that the universe promise you success. Imagine a person who wants to heal. If they force healing, they will judge every emotion, resist every wave of grief, demand quick results, and then feel ashamed when sadness returns. That shame becomes a new wound. That is forcing. If they practice not forcing, they still do the work. They seek support. They rest. They speak truth. They set boundaries. They meditate. They move the body. They do therapy if available. They do what is wise. But they stop demanding that healing be fast and linear. They stop punishing themselves when waves come. They accept that healing is like a plant. You cannot pull it into growth. You can provide conditions and let time do what time does. This is the kind of patience that becomes real power. Now let us bring compassion into the center. Because compassion is the heart that allows you to stop forcing. Without compassion, you will try to stop forcing by controlling yourself in a new way. You will say, I should not force. And you will force yourself not to force. That is still violence, just quieter. Compassion says, of course you want to force. You are scared. Of course you want to control. You want safety. Of course you want guarantee. You are human. Compassion does not shame the urge. It sees the urge, holds it gently, and then chooses wisdom. A compassionate approach might sound like this inside your mind. I feel the urge to force right now. I feel fear. I feel uncertainty. I want control. I understand. I am here. I can breathe. I can take one wise step. I do not need to solve everything in this moment. That inner voice is not soft in a weak way. It is soft in a strong way. It is the voice of a mind that has stopped being its own enemy. Now let us talk about one of the biggest places people force. Love. People force love by demanding constant reassurance. They force love by trying to control someone else's behavior. They force love by reading minds and punishing silence. They force love by clinging to a version of someone that no longer exists. They force love by treating affection like proof of worth. That love does not grow under pressure. Love grows under respect, honesty, and space. When you force love, you create fear in the relationship, and fear suffocates intimacy. When you practice not forcing, you allow love to be a living process. You communicate clearly. You set boundaries. You show care. You also allow the other person to be a human being, not a machine that dispenses security. Sometimes not forcing in love means letting someone be confused without taking it as rejection. Sometimes it means giving space without turning space into abandonment. Sometimes it means recognizing that your attachment is trying to turn the relationship into a guarantee. And no relationship can be a guarantee. Sometimes it means releasing a relationship that is built on anxiety. Because staying becomes a way of forcing both people to live in a cramped space. This is not cold. This is wise compassion. It is compassion for yourself and for the truth. Now let us talk about another place people force. The mind. The mind is not a button you can press to produce peace. The mind is a field. You plant seeds. You water them. You protect them. You remove weeds. Over time, the field changes. If you try to force the mind, you create more tension. And tension creates more thought. If you treat the mind with patient training, you gradually change your relationship to thought. The practice is simple, but not easy. Use it. You breathe. You notice thought. You return. You do not fight. You do not chase. You return. This return is awakening. This return is how you stop being controlled by internal weather. And if you practice this, you begin to notice something. Life still brings storms. People still disappoint you. Plans still break. Your body still changes. But your inner response becomes less extreme. You become less pulled around by every gust. You become more like the mountain. Weather moves across you, but you do not lose yourself. This is what it means when people say nothing can affect you. It does not mean you feel nothing. It means you do not lose your center. Now I want to share a modern example that might feel very close to your life. Imagine you send a message to someone you care about. Hours pass. No reply. Your mind begins forcing. It forces meaning into silence. They are ignoring me. They are angry. I did something wrong. I am not important. The body tightens. You want to send another message. Then another. Then another. You want to force the situation to resolve so your nervous system can relax. Not forcing would look like this. You notice the anxiety. You name it. Wanting. Attachment. You breathe. You remind yourself of impermanence. This feeling will change. You remember right view. You do not know the reason yet. You remember karma. If you send desperate messages, you plant causes of tension. If you wait and communicate calmly later, you plant causes of clarity. You choose one wise action. Maybe you do something grounding, like a walk, a meal, a short meditation. Later, if needed, you ask directly, unkindly, "Hey, are you okay?" That is not forcing. That is clear communication. Same silence, different destiny. Now let us bring it to something bigger. A career outcome. You want something badly. You apply. You interview. You wait. Your mind forces again. It imagines rejection. It imagines humiliation. It tries to control the future by rehearsing pain. That rehearsal does not protect you. It only steals the present. Not forcing would look like this. You do what you can do. You prepare. You show up. You follow up appropriately. Then you release. Not because you do not care, but because you understand you cannot control the entire chain of condition. You allow space for reality. You keep planting seeds elsewhere. You keep learning. You keep connecting. You keep practicing. If the outcome is yes, you receive it with gratitude without clinging. If the outcome is no, you grieve if needed, learn, and continue. You do not treat no as a permanent identity. This is the mature relationship with outcome. Now I want to connect this teaching with one more deep truth. Forcing often comes from the belief that you are not safe in the present. So the mind tries to escape into a controlled future. But the controlled future is imaginary. The only real place you can practice safety is now. Not perfect safety, because life is uncertain, but inner safety. The sense that you can be with your experience without abandoning yourself. This is why spiritual practice is so important. It builds the capacity to stay with discomfort without panic, to stay with uncertainty without collapsing, to stay with impermanence without hatred, to stay with your own heart. When you can stay, you stop forcing, because forcing is often a way to run. Now let me close the story of the young person, because the ending matters. Months passed. The young person kept practicing, imperfectly. Some days they forced again. They caught themselves and softened. Some days they panicked. They breathed and returned. Some days they tried to control others. They noticed the tension and chose a calmer response. This is how the path actually looks. It is not a straight line. It is a spiral. You revisit the same lessons at deeper levels. One day, the young person returned to the courtyard and found the old monk sweeping leaves again. The young person said, "I think I understand now. Not forcing does not mean no effort. It means effort without clinging." The monk smiled and said, "Good. Now show me." The young person took the broom and began sweeping. At first, they swept like they used to do everything. Fast, urgent, trying to finish. Leaves scattered. The broom caught on stones. The body tensed. The monk watched without criticism. Then the young person paused. They breathed. They remembered the cup. They remembered the plant. They softened their grip. They swept with attention. The broom moved smoothly. Leaves gathered. The work became simple. The mind became quiet. The monk said, "Do you feel it?" The young person nodded. "Yes, when I stop forcing, I can actually do the work." The monk said, "That is the secret. Forcing wastes energy. Right effort gathers energy. And when energy is gathered, wisdom becomes available." That is the whole teaching. If you take one thing from today, let it be this. Do the work that is yours, and release what is not yours. Create conditions with wise action, and do not choke the result with panic. Hold life with care, not with a clenched fist. Let impermanence be a teacher, not an enemy. Let karma be your compass, not your prison. Let compassion be the way you talk to yourself when you feel afraid. Let practice be how you return, again and again, to the present. Because when you finally stop forcing, it is not that life becomes perfect. It is that you stop turning life into a fight. And when the fight ends, a quiet clarity appears. In that clarity, you can see what is real. You can see what matters. You can see the next wise step. You can see the path. Now I would love to hear from you. Where are you forcing right now? And what would it look like to soften your grip by 1 degree today? Share your story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, hit like, and consider becoming a member so we can keep creating long, honest teachings together. Until next time, keep practicing, keep breathing, and keep walking the path with compassion.